Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Tamara Thorpe, and I am our host for our podcast for Making Connections, a handbook for effective formal mentoring programs in academia. I'm really excited and honored to be here today with the authors of Chapter 4, Formal Mentorship Programs, Characteristics, Benefits, and Outcomes. That was written and put together by Rachel Arocho and Benjamin Johnson, also known as Ben Johnson. Both of them are at Utah Valley State. Rachel Arocho is an assistant professor of family science in the Department of Behavioral Science at Utah Valley State. She received her undergraduate education at the Uintah Basin Regional Campus of Utah State University, where a faculty's generous mentorship led her to want an academic life and helped her achieve it. She also received her PhD in Human Development and Family Science from the Ohio State University and trained as a postdoctoral scholar at the Carolina Population Center at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill before joining faculty at UVU. Her research, which I think you'll hear in our conversation today, her research covers multiple aspects of family life, such as family life education, family demography, and teaching and learning, and often with undergraduate student mentees. She also, like many of our authors, mentors other faculty in various programs at UVU and is constantly being mentored herself by peers and more senior faculty, an opportunity that she does not take for granted, that is clearly reflected in her work and her research. Ben Johnson is an associate professor of higher education in the Department of Student Leadership and Success at Utah Valley University. He received his PhD in educational philosophy and psychology from the Ohio State University. And he co-founded with students the Journal of Student Leadership, a double-blind peer-reviewed publication, and helps students enhance their editing, design, and public publications and conference presentations related to educational design, self-regulated learning, metacognition, service learning, higher education leadership, faculty student mentoring, and first-year student experiences. So it is no surprise that we are here to listen to their experiences and expertise. So hello, Ben and Rachel, welcome.
Hello, thank you so much for having us.
Hi, welcome. Thank you. I appreciate it.
So your chapter is quite distinct in that it's really making the case for formal mentoring programs. So can you both share with me, or Rachel, start us off by sharing with me what inspired the work that you do in research and mentoring, and particularly your contributions to the book?
Yeah, so I'll be very honest in saying that I went into this not really I knew that mentoring was important. I think that was clear to me from personal experiences. That was clear to me from my training, from the research that I started doing and kind of teaching and learning and education, all that. But I didn't really fully grasp the difference between an informal and a formal situation, and why formal is so important, why that piece can be so important. So, I mean, I got into this because I believe in mentoring, but this chapter and doing the research for this and doing the writing for this really convinced me of the importance of the formalization part, which I'm sure we'll get into.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be a part of this and to kind of encapsulate some of the things that we've been thinking all along. And so I'm grateful for Rachel, who included me on this project.
So it's really clear from the work that both of you do that mentoring, as you said, Rachel, it has been a long part of your work and your contributions. And so as you were doing the work, as you said, in this discovery, how would you differentiate informal mentoring from formal mentoring?
A great question, because that's one we had to wrestle with quite a bit. And honestly, some of the most important pieces of my thinking, and I think Ben would agree with this, you can correct me, but was talking with Nora Dominguez, one of the editors of this handbook, because she really was able to kind of break it down and give us like the distinction. So this is what we mean by formal. And according to her definition and what we ended up working with, that I think did it put the literature into perspective, was the involvement of a third party. That formal mentoring is bigger than just the relationship between the mentor and the mentee because of some third party. Now, what that third party does, who they actually are, how involved they are, that can vary quite a bit. But being able to recognize that that was kind of the distinction, like, oh, that clicked into, okay, now that's formal mentoring. Now we can understand the difference and why we might want to move in that direction in some cases.
So this to me is quite fascinating, in part because of the work that I do, but also as I was reading through and you were sort of identifying those differentiating factors, because I think many of us can probably quickly reference a mentor that we've had that probably came through an informal mentoring experience. They were a parent, a teacher, a coach, and that feels in many ways very accessible. And then there's these aspects of the formal mentoring that include this third party that, as you have said, and we'll see in later chapters that we have lots of chapters that outline for that third party, whether it's a program coordinator, a department head, somebody who just wants to champion mentorship, how to build that mentoring program. But there is quite, but that in many cases might seem less accessible to folks. And one of the aspects that you do talk about in your chapter is this idea of access and equity, right? Like who has access to informal mentoring and who has access to formal mentoring? Can you talk a little bit about that sort of accessibility and how that informed your work?
Definitely. That became to me the key piece here. Is you're right. I can absolutely think of, one of the most impactful mentors in my life is David Law, the other editor of this handbook. And so, when I thought about my relationship to him, it was very much it developed informally, right? He was my professor first, but then we started talking and that became very, very important to me. And it's because of him that I have the life I have. I joke that I blame him for everything because it was even through him that I met my husband. But particularly professionally, he was key to that. And I started to think, like, what would my life have looked like if I hadn't had that opportunity? And again, that was an informal instance, right? But so building in formal instances, I believe, can create more opportunities for that for everyone, because I had some particular experiences that allowed me to have that informal mentorship, right? Because of where I was living and the interactions I had with him, and actually an interaction of my mom going to college. Like there was a lot of kind of key factors that any one of those could have been missing. Whereas if there was a formal mechanism by which people could at least be introduced, at least get started with relationships, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that the formal relationships are all going to be pushed into certain levels, right? But just to give the opportunity to meet with receptive, mentors, to have mentees know that they need some mentoring. I think that was key. Is I wouldn't have known until I met a mentor. And so as we started doing this work, as I started reading through the benefits of mentorship and recognizing in myself, right, like this is key, this has been key to my life, trying to understand what leads people into mentoring relationships became really interesting to me. And then recognizing that there's a lot of privilege, serendipity, there's a lot of ways that we get into mentoring, but that formalizing it, at least at some level, right, at kind of what we're doing or who we're doing it with or when we're doing it, could really open that door in a way that I think is really important. This is not to say that informal mentoring is not important, right? Or to say that we shouldn't allow for those opportunities, absolutely. But I think the formalized mentoring can build a framework that can hopefully, and this isn't just me saying this is what the literature is suggesting, allow for more equitable opportunities and accessibility to more people who could really use this kind of relationship.
Yeah, I think I just kind of basically echo and confirm what Rachel's saying. It's, a lot of us think and remember the informal opportunities that we've had, the informal but there were probably some kind of formalized, mechanism in place that led to that informal mentoring opportunity. And that's also what's been made clear to me through our research here and through reflection as well, for me, back as an undergraduate, having a professor that saw some promise in me, invited me on a research investigation to Brussels, right? And then from there, feeling like I'm qualified to go to graduate school and so forth, and working with professors there. And then as a faculty member, even now, getting that mentoring from peers or through the retention, tenure, and promotion process. And so it's not only personalized, but it's, the literature indicates over and over that if we can focus on creating those formal opportunities, even if there are derivative informal opportunities that come from that, and sometimes very derivative, it's still better off by having that formal foundation.
So thank you both so much for sharing that, because I think that certainly as I was reading through your chapter and reflecting on my own experiences, I know that in structured organizations like higher ed or in a business, that folks in different positions with different opportunities are going to have access to those informal mentoring, those networks, sponsors, mentors, etc. And we know from the organizational research that particularly women and people of color are less likely to have those informal mentoring relationships than their counterparts, right? Their male and their white counterparts. And so there is those benefits, right, in formalizing a mentoring program in higher ed and in organizations that create greater access. I know in my undergraduate education that I likely would not have had a mentor had there not been some structured resources available for me as a student of color. Because of, when I think of the enormous challenges I had getting support buy-in from faculty in my undergrad, it was really quite challenging in many cases. What's the word? Demotivating. But having the support through a formal peer mentoring program changed everything for me. Really, it was really quite significant. So let's talk about those benefits, particularly for your experience in higher ed. When we formalize a mentoring program, in addition to equity and access, what are the benefits? Why would an organization or an institution invest the time and resources into formalizing mentoring if they know from qualitative research that it's happening?
Yeah, so this was a good question, right? Because it takes resources, it takes the time. And so mentoring broadly, kind of in this chapter, we wanted to review both mentoring broadly, what are the things, and we've already discussed them, right? Anecdotally, but they also show up in the evidence that, everything from academic outcomes to social outcomes to for professors, research productivity, all of that. So when we formalize it, we not only can build those up, right, have a greater opportunity for people to be receiving better social skills, academic outcomes, all of those things. But we make the argument, and I hope that Ben will expound on this a little bit too, but that by formalizing it, we can start to recognize the work that goes into mentoring, and we can have more opportunities for mentors and mentees to be prepared for their mentoring relationship, because a lot of the skills that make mentoring work from both sides, both the mentor and the mentee, are things that we sometimes need reminded of or even sometimes outright taught. It may not come naturally to everyone. And so by formalizing a process in which mentees are prepared, right? By, for example, talking to them about what should you get from this relationship? How do you make sure that it's working? Who do you tell if it's not, if there's an issue? How do you find a secondary mentor? Because we all know one is not enough. Preparing mentees that way could lead to just a better, better experience for them. Preparing mentors also, right? That if a mentor comes in and has the best intentions, that may still not be quite enough if they don't have the skills, the preparation, understanding what they're supposed to be doing. So by formalizing it from that direction, that can help. And then at a higher, even a higher level than that, formalizing a mentoring program within, for instance, higher education can allow us to see the work that goes into it, because so much of mentoring is not super visible. Right? Eventually, I work with a lot of students, right? And eventually, if we get a paper published, then cool, I have a tangible outcome that I can point to their names and say, look, I mentored students. But that is a very, very small piece of what I do overall with my students and the time that I spend with them and the effort I put into it. And so if we can recognize it more formally to say, you know, we know that this is the work that Rachel's putting into it, or this is the work that's expected of a mentor within this program, then it can be more well recognized for things like retention, tenure, promotion process, right? For service load. We can maybe, that's my hope anyway, is that we can start to recognize the work of it, because mentoring is hard work.
Yeah, it's a challenge sometimes when we think that we have a lot to improve on, and when I think about women faculty and minority faculty and women and minority students, for example, and including our more general category of part-time faculty who sometimes think they don't have the disciplinary skills to kind of help students with, for example, mentor research or things like that, when actually they do. And one of the most rewarding benefits of some of the work that we've done, and to give a more specific example as well, is a mentoring undergraduate research academy, where we've taught faculty to think about their work kind of metacognitively. They come up with a mentoring philosophy, and rather than, sometimes they just have a teaching philosophy or research philosophy, this is actually a mentoring philosophy. And so that way they can think about working with diverse students. How am I going to include diverse students? Right. And sometimes the temptation is just to include whoever can work with you on a project, but can we be more purposeful and attracting a more diverse body of students to work with? And that ultimately helps everybody. It's rewarding. That's a benefit for the faculty, that they are creating these rewarding opportunities, and for the students, and it's overall it's great to see that.
Yeah, I think that you both hit two really important points, right? That the structure allows for the vast amount of training and resources that enhance mentoring relationships. I know myself in the mentoring programs that I build, so often I have mentors who say, well, what do I talk about? Right. And often mentors who are exceptional, who've reached very high levels within their profession, can still feel like they don't have a lot to share. So providing training and resources that enable them to maximize their time with their mentors is so important. And then Rachel, you talked about being able to have those outcomes that we can measure, so we can qualify and quantify the impacts of a mentoring relationship. That's what formalization does. And to the point then that you talked about, it does create opportunity for mentors to move outside of their comfort zone a little bit, and to think about identifying and reaching communities and students and colleagues that might not be in their immediate. I mean, that's one of the challenges we have in organizations and institutions. It's not that people are intentionally trying to exclude people, but we do, because of how our brains work, and the pressures go to who we know, right? And often who we know are people who are like us, right? And so that means that we're not creating those opportunities, or pushing or challenging ourselves to move outside of what we know. So one of the things that you did mention, Rachel, that you talk about in your chapter, that is a nice section on it that I think is important, is about poor mentoring. And so can we talk about poor mentoring? Because Very often we remember mentoring relationships that had a positive impact on us. We may have had mentors that had a negative impact on us, but we may not think of them as mentors. But whether it's an informal or informal mentoring, there is such a thing as poor mentoring. So what is it, and why is it important to know about it? And how does formal mentoring allow us to mitigate it?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, because that was a side of mentoring I hadn't really thought about either. Like you're saying, I have all these great pictures of people who have been important mentors for me. Even more so than having a poor mentor myself, though I recognize that I've sometimes not been the best mentor. I was unprepared for one of my very first relationships in which I was to mentor a student through a summer research project, and it didn't go very well. And poor mentoring can range, right? In the case that I'm describing, it's just that we didn't accomplish anything. But poor mentoring can also actually be quite damaging in the relationship. And, you know, if a mentor or a mentee is not respecting boundaries, those are some ways that mentoring can become bad. And so we do want to do what we can to protect against that, right? We want everyone to understand their boundaries, to understand, you know, this is the kind of relationship we have, and we don't cross certain things. To understand this is how we move forward in our projects, this is how we have our meetings, this is what we talk about, kind of things. Like there's a lot of ways it can go wrong, but then there are ways that we can mitigate. And I think that formalization is one of the pieces that can help with that, both by like the preparation. Had I had some preparation for that first one, had I had some expectation, and in this case, I'm not going to take all the blame. The mentee, I don't think, was fully understood their role of what they needed to do and what I was able to do in our project and in our relationship. And so I think, you know, both of us could have used some preparation there. Formal mentoring can also help build in a little bit of an accountability mechanism and build in an option for if a mentee or a mentor is feeling like things just aren't working, giving them a resource to come and you know, maybe the first thing is just coming and saying, I don't know what I'm doing, can you help me, right? And this third party could provide some assistance there. Or on a more serious level, right, if a mentee comes and says, I don't think this is right, I think something's happening, then there's a party who can kind of work over a power differential, because it can be really hard for a mentee to be able to tell a mentor, I don't think this is appropriate, or I'm having trouble with this, or something's happening, right? And so a third party can be at a different level and be able to help with that as well. So I think those stood out to me as really important factors for formal mentoring, is being able to kind of provide oversight, provide a different power, you know, person in a different level of power, and then kind of watch for that preparation just broadly. You know, I'm all about prevention. If we can start with prevention, I think that can help with this, but then also it provides a level for intervention if we need it.
One thing that Rachel highlighted was the fact that having one, you know, being aware of the dangers of just one single individual as a mentor. And so, you know, sometimes there are power structures in play there that can be problematic, helping mentees realize that there are others. There's not just one person who has it all. And so being aware of those potential drawbacks ahead of time, and making sure everybody's aware that, you know, maybe the mentorship needs to change, and that's okay.
Yeah, I agree. And actually the previous chapter 3, talks about the different types of mentoring relationships. And it is important to have those different types, and for many cases, particularly in organizations and institutions, to have that developmental network, to have different mentors for different reasons, and not relying on that one person to be the source of all things good, particularly if it isn't a great match. So I'm thinking about, you know, folks who are where you all were before you started this, right? In that transition of making that leap from informal to formal. So what advice would you give to someone who knows that there's some informal mentoring happening? Folks feel good about it, but know that formal mentoring can take it up a next level, what advice would you give to that faculty member, that department manager, leader, somebody who really wants to champion for a formal mentoring program?
So my number one piece of advice, and honestly, this is in most areas of my life, but is don't be afraid to iterate, right? Don't feel like the first thing you implement has to be perfect and has to be what you stick to. And I think that that goes doubly for a formal mentoring situation like this, where there was no one model that emerged. I mean, you were just talking about that there's literally just different ways to mentor and different structures to mentor, and there's tons of different ways then to formalize any one of those structures or processes. And so, you know, everything from, I read about programs that only do a matching, right? So they're formal in that you get involved with it, and then they match, they kind of find some similarities. They say, okay, you're a mentor, a mentee, you're a mentor, mentee, and then go, right? And then there are others that had really laid out curriculum that this is what we need you to discuss this week. This is what you need to discuss this week. This is how you're going to show that you've done that. You know, both of those can work beautifully. And your area, your group that you're working with might need more support, might need less support, might need more support one year and less the next, just because they're growing, right? And so don't be married to anything would be my big advice. Be creative, be willing to listen to the feedback, and ask yourself, can we do this? Can we do this a little differently? Can we do this a little new? What can we change to make this even better as we continue?
And I would add to that imagination is the key to help it go through. Right? So being adaptable, advocating, maybe we need to make a particular argument to a certain set of people, or track data in a certain way that helps make the case. And then knowing that sometimes you can't convince others, right? And so maybe you have to scale things back. Maybe you have to try a different version, just like what Rachel was saying, iterate. But so that's why I would bring it back to imagination, and thinking about the possibilities is really what makes it rewarding, and also potentially very productive.
That's fantastic. I love that, because I think once folks get further along the book, and particularly into the case studies, we're going to see some really well-structured models of formalized mentoring. But many of those have come through having a lot of resources and a lot of trial and error, and it can be intimidating for folks who maybe want something formal, but not so formal, not so structured. So really great advice. I certainly am taking it into heart. I know that as I was reading through your chapter, there was a little bit of a like, right, it took a little bit of the pressure off of having to have it right, have everything in place, and know what's going to work right away. So I really appreciated that those points as I was reading through. So as we close, I would love for you both to share, when you're thinking about a mentoring program. I know that many of our listeners are folks who probably are at the early stage of planning or implementing a mentoring program. And some may have plenty of resources, some may have few. But from your perspective, your experience, what do you think is a must-have in a mentoring program?
So the absolute must-have that we discussed was we want to make sure that everyone knows that their mentor or their mentee is not their only point of contact, that you can always talk to others about your what's happening. And so if that's your third party, your program coordinator, your department chair, whoever's put that in, that's important. That's one of the benefits, right, that we talked about of having a formalized setting here. But then also, like we talked about, having a second mentor if you need it, right? Or having a peer mentor in addition to your faculty mentor, or, making sure that you're not pinning everything on one person is good both for you and for them.
Yes, I would just say yes. I agree fully with that.
Yeah, that's great. And I think one of the things, as folks read through the book, they'll note how many programs have built in that peer mentoring component with the mentees in the program, and for the mentors. The mentors are peer mentoring and the mentees are peer mentoring, because that creates an entirely new dynamic. So that is just such great advice. And so what is a nice to have? Maybe I can't have everything, but if I could have an extra, what is a nice to have?
So one of the nice things that I did think that came out from the literature to me was a matching process. That doesn't necessarily have to be like a fill out a dating app kind of, profile, and then we match you based on this proprietary algorithm, right? But just giving an opportunity for giving someone else to talk to, even if that doesn't become their primary, and especially like we just talked about, their only mentor, but kind of setting the stage, opening the door for that. I know that was one of the most important things for me when I first started here as an assistant professor, is I was assigned a formal mentor. And it was important to me just to know that I had his ear. If I did have a stupid question that I felt bad, like bothering someone with, he was already officially there to be bothered. And so that was really helpful, even though that was an extremely low level. Like, it wasn't this big detailed thing. It was like, he's available, she's new, let's, but that was really, really helpful to me to have a matching process. And I think that that could be scaled as you need it, but that does seem to be a helpful piece.
Another is funding for the program. So if you have money, you can do things like lunches, stipends, on or beyond the campus opportunities, right? Now they don't need to be extravagant necessarily, but acknowledging the work of people and is always helpful.
That's amazing. I think I think money for lunch is a pretty consistent nice to have, but I think that speaks to the value of bringing people together and breaking bread and building community, and how impactful that can be for a formal mentoring program. And so lastly, what's something we can live without?
Super duper assessment of the wrong things. Sometimes when we think about formalizing mentoring, we think, well, that means that we're going to need to collect all this outcome data. But sometimes the things that are really, really important from a mentoring relationship may not be measurable in the short term, may not be measurable at all. So recognizing that, yeah, we want to collect kind of efficacy data, right? Are people actually talking to their mentors? What are they talking about? Is it actually helping? Do students persist? Do faculty persist? That kind of thing is useful, but putting too much focus on those might undermine some of the efforts of kind of the relationship that can develop. Because back at the very beginning of this, right, we talked about, we don't want to say informal mentoring is bad. We don't want to say it shouldn't be done. A lot of times, like Ben described, it does grow out of the formal mentoring. And so that may not be something that we always see from it. So the formal mentoring relationship itself, recognizing what we should be measuring from it and not trying to choke it out with too many assessments.
Yeah, and for example, we might have a new student training orientation or a new employee orientation, and if we're having assessments in that, how effective was this, this type of thing, yeah, you might get at some level of yeah, this was helpful or useful, but maybe it's the relationships that were formed that created new opportunities that weren't assessed, that came out of this, that actually were by far more beneficial from that experience. So you meet somebody, and those relationships are paramount and lead to other opportunities. And sometimes assessment can't get the detailed the super detailed assessment that Rachel describes. Even that can't get at some of those beyond that opportunity, mentoring that can happen.
That's phenomenal. A great tee up for the chapter that follows yours, that focuses on data analytics and needs assessment, right? So a great tee up for Neil Leisure and his chapter on needs assessment and data analytics. Because measurement is important, but we can get bogged down in evaluating and assessing everything when that isn't necessary. And certainly, as you all were saying that, I had a couple of sparks go off in my head of like, yeah, this is where assessment can be most valuable. So thank you for that incredible advice. Thank you for your contributions to the book. I thought your insights were incredibly valuable for me and the work that I do as a program coordinator and a consultant in the mentoring space. I appreciate and value the work that you both do in your community. So thank you both also for today's conversation. It was wonderful to have both of you.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to work on this chapter. I think I learned so much from it. And so it's been a lot of fun to get to discuss it with you here today.
I thoroughly enjoyed our meeting with you. Thank you.
So thank you both. Thank you everyone for listening and watching today. We look forward to having you again in our next podcast episode. Bye-bye.